So this is a fast focus. It's 20 minutes. It means it's going to be fast. If you look at the bottom of the slides, and the slides are out there on the website, there's the URL for the repository that has the code. We're not going to get in the code today because that's not enough time. Who am I? I am the CTO, Chief Architect for one of the largest personal injury law firms in the US. I've written a bunch of books. I run the user group back home. I speak at all the VS Lives, blah, 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 blah. One thing I do want to call out is in July and December of every year, I do a 4-day hands-on virtual workshop through VS Live. So we are going to cover everything in .NET. We start with EF Core. We build a Razor Pages application. We build an MVC application. We build an API. And we build a Blazor WASM application, all in 4 days. Right now, it's on a pretty deep discount. If you register by June 19th, just go to vs5.com, go to online, look for the 4-day. Versioning options. So what are the formats that we can use to version APIs? So it's major, minor. It is not semantic versioning, right? So you have major, minor. The minor can be omitted if it's a version 0. So with APIs, version 1 is exactly equivalent to 1.0. Not to 1.1, but you all knew that. And then if you're going to have some sort of nomenclature afterwards, alpha, beta, RC, things like that, it's a dash. So period between versions, dash for status. There's also a grouping construct that you can use. It is date format. It has nothing to do with a date. That's just a format. I'm not a fan of this. We'll get into why a little bit later. But let's talk about versioning options. There's 4 ways we can version a URI. We can do it in the URL. Right? This is URL segment versioning. This has long been my favorite as a consultant. Not so much anymore now that I'm dealing with people who are less technical. A lot of the case management systems have these little wizards where you can plug in a URL and have it make API calls. Having to change the URL for every version has become quite a bit of a problem. But this is a very common way to do it. I'm going to show you how to update ASP.NET Core to support that. Query string parameter, very popular, right? Question API-version, that is a default name. I'll show you in the later talk today. You can change all those names to be, V or whatever you want to be. Header, this is not officially compliant with the Microsoft REST guidelines. And if you're thinking, what does that mean? It means nothing. So Microsoft has put together a very long document on REST guidelines. It's got some good information in it. It's got some less than great information in it. Know that this is an industry accepted standard. It's just not as popular, but that's coming in as an HTTP header. You can also use media type, also not compliant, but generally accepted, where you have a content type where you say V or API version or whatever your keyword is equals the number of the version. If content type and accept are both present, content type wins. So when you're using media type, it can be content type or accept, right? If you use both, you're going to confuse people. And if you use both, content type wins. So those are the 4 ways that we can pass in a version. Group versioning is an optional feature. Again, using a date format. Doesn't replace the major minor version. So what happens is you have this group, and below that you have version 1, version 1.1, version 2, version 3. Then you have another group with a version 1 and a version 1.1 and a version 2 and a version 3. To me, that's confusing, right? Because if I'm talking about version 1, which version 1 am I talking about? And I want my code to be very easily read by others. I said this yesterday, I say it almost every time I give a talk. You want to imagine that the next person looking at your code is an axe-wielding psychopath, right? Because in reality, who is the next person looking at your code? It's going to be yourself, right? 6 months down the road, you're going to look at it and, oh my gosh, which version 1 am I talking about? Who wrote this crap? And then you look at the commit log and you spend the weekend cleaning up your mistakes, right? But it is accepted, and you might have a valid reason to use it. I think it causes confusion. That's just my opinion. So how do we version a web service? It's actually very, very easy. We add in the package asp.versioning.mvc. Now, this is a new package that came out with .NET 8. There was a previous package, I think it was Microsoft ASP.NET Core, or Microsoft ASP.NET Core.versioning or something like that. This is a relatively new package, right? So in our program.cs, in our configure services section of the program.cs, that's the part before you build the web app, you're going to call builder services add API versioning.addMVC. You also should add problem details. So the RFC, for when there is an issue, there's an RFC spec called problem details. I don't know the spec number, I don't care. And it is just a format of how the JSON comes back when there's an issue with your site, right? So instead of giving them a 500, you give them a 200 with the problem details. And the versioning will leverage the problem details if somebody asks for a version that doesn't exist. That's why we want to add in the problem details into our DI container. If you're using attribute routing for controllers, as you should be, and you're using URL versioning, you're going to update the route, and I will show you how to do that. Then you add the version attributes to your controllers, right? And then if you want to get the version from that was requested in the call, there's a number of mechanisms to do this. So let's look at some code. So here we have actually before we do this, I have time. Add API versioning. So this is how we add it in right here, and there's options. Default API version. We want to tell it a default. In the later talk, I'm going to go into much more details why that's important. But assume default version when unspecified. So if somebody calls your endpoint and doesn't tell you a version, instead of having it puke, you can have it go to whatever you define as a default version. So default version 1, default version 2. Report API versions. That is true by default, but I like to call it out. So every API call, if default API versions is true, will then return in the headers all of the available versions in your API. So there'll be regular versions and deprecated will be listed. Here is the version reader. This is how you can set up how you want the version to be read. So URL segment, query string. You can change what the default is, header, media type, etc. So now we have versioning turned on. We want to version our endpoints. What do? We start adding the API version attribute to our controllers. We want to add it at the controller level. Controller level, all action methods inherit the version. You can supersede it. You can put a different version on an action method than what is defined on the controller. Totally legit. Bad idea. The reason I think it's a bad idea is the same reason why I don't like the date format grouping is if I'm looking at my controller, and this afternoon I'm going to show you how you can name your controllers to match the versions. Right now I'm looking at my API version 2. Oh, well, I was looking for a method that was in version 3. And if you bury it in a controller that's marked version 2, now it's getting hard to find. Right, so again, I'm thinking about that next person looking at the code. If you look at this route down here, this is how you add in URL segment versioning into ASP.NET Core. So you have API/v, and then this is a token, version : API version, and then the framework. What we added into the DI container with add API version will automatically update the URL in this route to match the version that is being requested. Here's what I'm talking about. You can interleave versions. That's the formal name for it. I still think it's a bad idea. I keep all of my controllers separate. Here's the number 2 Hello World controller, but I have version 3 in here also. I just think it gets confusing. And then map to API is just another way of saying, I know I'm in this version, but let's map it to the 3.0 version. Map to API version, I never use in production. It's a feature. You can use it. It's there. This is awesome, and it's important to understand. If you want to deprecate a version, all you have to do in the version attribute is say deprecated equals true. There's a catch. It has nothing to do with versioning. If you mark one of your API version attributes, version 2, as deprecated, all of the version 2 will be deprecated. However, the documentation does not guarantee, in other words, open API, right? You build your swagger.json. It's not going to guarantee that it reads the versions in order. So you're going to want to mark every single one of your API version 1.0 deprecated equals true with the deprecated equals true, right? Because if you got one that is marked deprecated, one that's not deprecated, the deprecation wins, but the documentation that we have doesn't always pick that up. Does that make sense? Again, another reason why you should do this at the controller level and not all the action methods. You can advertise versions outside of the controller hierarchy. This is important to understand. We're going to talk a lot more about it this afternoon, but the way that the documentation works, it looks at your controller hierarchy, and it will say, these are the versions that are supported. So that presumes you've got a base controller. I'm going to show you that this afternoon. It's a very, very powerful feature that you can do with versioning and documentation, and then everything that derives from it. But you've got another set of controllers over here that have different versions that won't get picked up by the documentation. They still work. There's nothing functionally wrong with it. But what you want to do then is say, you know what, I'm going to advertise these other versions. So if you're looking at the JSON for my Hello World controller, it's going to say that there's other versions out there for other endpoints. Right? So really, keep that in your back pocket. If the documentation isn't working as you really expect it to, you might have to advertise the other versions. It has nothing to do with the functionality of the app, 100%. You're advertising for the JSON documentation. Version neutrality, this is an important one also. If you have a health check, right, and all of our APIs do, we just have an endpoint that we can call and secure, but it just says, hey, can I connect to the database? Can I do these things? Is my site up and running? And then I return a 200. Well, you don't necessarily want that behind a version, right? I'm just going to ping this thing with some service or some other testing. So we could do API version neutral. And when we say API version neutral, it says you can ask for version 99. It'll still hit this endpoint. When we talk about routing in APIs, typically we don't route at the action method also, right? So API/controller name, right? If we look at, so here's controller, here's action. You can, that's more of an MVC web application format. Typically on an API, we won't include the action as part of the route, but you can. The route's controlled by this route attribute, then the verb, right? Get, put, post, delete, options, all of them are supported in RESTful APIs in ASP.NET Core. And then the version. So the version becomes part of the route. So if you ask for something that is outside of a supported version and you have problem details turned on, you'll get a 404. Right? Even though it's a perfectly valid route in your mind, the version is part of the route. All right, I have this version neutral thing, or I version interleaved, and I want to know what version they called in with. I have a couple options here. One, we can use model binding. That's down here where I have API version, right? That's just a variable name. That's the type. and that will then get injected into the method by the framework, and it will have all the version information that was requested coming in. If it's version neutral, there'll be no data, obviously. Or we can just call HTTP context get requested API version. That is an extension method brought in by the API versioning setup, and then we can get the version. Why would we care? Well, there's a couple ways we can deal with version changes, right? One is, and I'm going to show you this technique. It's what we do in production, where you have an inheritance chain for each version, but other people will do version interleaving to say, hey, you know what? All of these methods are version 1 and version 2, but I'm going to have a different controller for the ones that are just version 2. And if you're coming into this controller that has version interleaving turned on, and you need to know which version they're calling from or asking for, then it's always helpful to be able to go in and get the version information. So if we look at our versions, controllers, nope, yep, API, version 1 controller, version 2 controller. This is a really nice feature in ASP.NET Core. When you turn on versioning and documentation, you can put a number here. Now, we all know that in a route, when you have a controller as a route, the word, the suffix controller is not part of the route, right? So version controller, the route is version. We can put a number in there. It has to be a whole number. It can be any number of digits. It can't be any punctuation or anything else. But for example, version 2 controller, the route for that is still version. So this is an awesome way to handle different versions and know where to find it in code. So you have version 1 controller is all your version 1 stuff, as I have here. My version 2 controller has all my version 2 stuff. So real quickly, if you want to not repeat all of your code between versions, you can do this. Here's my version 1 controller, and things that are changing in version 2, I inherit from version 1 controller, call it version 2 controller. So now my file names are nice and tidy, label it, decorate it with the version 2 attribute, and then I just overwrite the methods that changed. So instead of having to copy my 200 methods that didn't change in version 2 into this other controller, I just use an inheritance chain. So thank you for coming. If you want the long version, it's an hour and 15 minutes-ish. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you're enjoying the conference.